Within weeks of the wedding, Henry was back on the streets with Jimmy Burke and the rest of his fellow wise guys. Henry, like most wise guys, was rarely home. He was on the streets, making deals. He was a whiz at bookmaking, loan sharking, and running numbers. Hill, Burke, and the members of Paul Vario's mafia crew stole anything that had street value. At first, Karen was able to turn a blind eye to her husband's criminal activities. Then, in December 1965, Hill was arrested for transporting untaxed cigarettes across state lines. He was sent to jail for several hours and paid a fine. Karen could no longer fool herself into believing that Henry was a union bricklayer. Instead of being angry, she embraced the mob lifestyle.
Karen saw the money. She liked it just as much as Henry did. She saw the action. I mean, Karen was a female wise guy.
A year after their wedding, a son, Greg, was born. 2 years later, Karen gave birth to a daughter, Abigail. She was frustrated to find that her gangster husband was an absentee father.
Henry would leave the home and be away for days and weeks at a time, and Karen was left to raise the children on her own.
They were either madly in love or they were fighting terrible. And she was, believe me, she fought back just as she gave as good as she got. Karen, she was an equal match for him.
Karen also came to realize that Henry was cheating on her regularly. Hill lived by the gangster motto that Friday nights were for the girlfriends and Saturday nights for the wives.
Certainly Karen was not stupid. None of the women are stupid. They were willing to look the other way in many incidences. At the chosen field that their husbands choose, the work they do, the way they earn their money, and their lifestyles on a personal level.
A lifestyle that for Henry included a growing problem with alcohol, a problem that was perhaps the only thing Henry really shared with his father.
I hated it. I never wanted to be was like my father, and I became my father with drinking.
He was the worst drunk I ever saw in my life. There wasn't anybody he wouldn't start a fight with. There wasn't anybody he wouldn't say anything to. He didn't care. He didn't care about himself or anyone else.
What he did care about was the mob and making money. Hill would soon find himself in a dangerous mess, committing the one kind of crime that Paul Vario warned him against, trafficking drugs.
Just stay away from the garbage, you know what I mean?
Look, Paulie,
I'm not talking about what you did inside. You did what you had to do. I'm talking about now, from now, here and now.
Paulie, why would I want to get into that?
Don't make a jerk out of me. Just don't do it. Just don't do it.
By the early 1970s, Henry Hill had earned a solid place for himself in the New York underworld. He was a loyal, wise guy, willing to use any means necessary to help his crime family. In October 1972, Hill was conducting some mob family business in Tampa, Florida. The 29-year-old was with his mentor and fellow Irishman, Jimmy Burke. They confronted a man in a bar who owed the family some money. Henry and Jimmy demanded that he pay up in typical mob fashion.
This was achieved, among other ways, by beating him into a pulp. And when that didn't seem to work, they brought him to the zoo and threatened to throw him into the lion's den.
Henry and Jimmy had no idea that the man they were terrorizing had a sister who worked for the FBI. It wasn't long before both Hill and Burke were charged with kidnapping and attempted murder. They beat that rap, but the federal government got in the act and indicted them for extortion. A jury found them guilty, and they were each sentenced to 10 years in prison. Hill began serving his time at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania in September 1974. He was pleased to find that for wise guys, prison wasn't much different than the streets. Even his mafia father figure, Paul Vario, was there, serving time for fraud.
Here is Paulie, Henry, a dozen other cronies. They're sitting at a table, cold cuts, antipasta, bottles of wine, bottles of whiskey, right on the table. This is conning and hustling, running their game, and they had everything going on while they were in prison.
That included selling drugs. Henry realized that narcotics were the hottest commodity in prison. He began selling cocaine and marijuana to guards and fellow inmates. A dangerous step because Vario and all the other mob bosses were against drug dealing. Henry came up with a clever scheme. He would have his connections on the street deliver the drugs to his wife, Karen.
She was a way for me to get drugs into prison. You know, I'd have people drop them off to her, and she'd bring them into me.
Henry was still in prison in February 1978 when his father, a man he had disappointed for most of his life, died of pancreatic cancer.
He came to the funeral, came with a guard, and he came in his jail clothes. He actually had to use one of my father's suits to wear to the funeral. He acted cool, he acted detached from it.
Hill was paroled that fall and returned to New York. Money had been tight for Karen and the kids while he was in prison, so Henry's first concern was getting his hands on some cash, and fast.
He decided to get into the dope selling business, which is always a loser. Worse, Henry decided to become a dope addict.
Henry was into just about everything. Henry, anything he could make a buck at. Anytime he could beat somebody, Henry was happy.
It was then that Henry Hill, just out of prison, got a very hot tip. He learned that a shipment of millions of dollars in jewels and untraceable cash would be sitting in the Lufthansa cargo hold at New York's JFK Airport. Hill passed the information on to his mentor and closest friend in the mob, Jimmy Burke. Burke, along with the rest of Paul Vario's mob crew, began planning the heist of a lifetime. On December 10, 1978, Henry spent the night at his girlfriend's apartment in Manhattan.
I didn't even know it went down until that morning. I was taking a shower and I heard it on the radio.
And it was, at the time, the largest armed robbery in history, American history. And it was 5 guys walked into the Lufthansa cargo area, held it up, and got away with a little over $5 million in cash and $1 million in jewelry.
Hill wasn't involved in the heist itself, but claims that his piece of the action was a $50,000 payment for having tipped off Jimmy Burke. It was Henry's proudest moment as a gangster. He and Jimmy had made mafia history. Then some of the mobsters who had pulled off the heist began getting sloppy, spending their new money on cars and expensive clothes for their girlfriends, things that might attract the attention of law enforcement. Jimmy Burke was furious at their lack of discretion and had an effective solution.